To the Manufacturing Hub podcast with me and Dave, that is currently on my left, I suppose, in the windows. We are on episode 100. We wanted to bring you something very special, a little bit different than what we've done in the past. Our goal is to review what we've done over the last 2 years, maybe discuss some of the episodes. We're going to be presenting some interesting clips. They are by no means necessarily the best information that we've gotten, but we just found something really interesting that we wanted to bring into the conversation today. I think we had many, many interesting guests, many different conversations, but we handpicked a couple of the ones that we enjoyed. And so today, me and Dave are going to be showcasing one clip at a time. We're going to have a discussion. If you are joining us from the comment section on LinkedIn or on Solus PLC, make sure to leave us a comment, ask us a question. More than happy to address that. At the same time, you may have noticed our layout is slightly different today. We are testing out a different way of streaming. So if there's any comments, any suggestions, or maybe even any challenges, any audio or video problems, make sure to let us know. But without further delay, Dave, do you have some opening comments for us?
I do, Vlad. First and foremost, congratulations. Thank you for introducing the show for the first time on this 100th episode. I can say without a doubt, I see why I introduced the show as opposed to you introducing the show. You've certainly set us up for maybe not so much success. As we go in, a couple of community comments. So if you guys are listening on podcast form, this may be the first time you're hearing community comments. Typically on the live shows, I go do a first couple of minutes of community comments before we go ahead and bounce live. So if you're listening on podcast form, like community comments, what we're talking about, feel free to let us know. And also, if you're listening in podcast form, Wednesdays, 4 o'clock East Coast time on LinkedIn and Solus PLC YouTube is where you can generally find us. Before we kick off, I guess kind of one big thing. I will be at Hanover. Hanover, either Mess or Messy. I've heard it pronounced a couple of different ways. Realized my German is terrible. So if you're going to be at Hanover in Germany, middle of April, I will be there with some Manufacturing Hub stuff. We're going to do some live builds. Please go ahead, drop some comments below, drop me a message. Would love to get together. We may or may not have swag that Vlad doesn't know about yet that will be coming out and making its first point known during the show. So please feel free to go ahead and drop me a message. Please feel free to go ahead and drop me a message. Without that, Vlad, go for it.
So, the first episode that I wanted to bring to everybody comes from episode 23. So, this is almost 2 years ago, Dave. We talked to Billy Alberton, and he shared a wealth of insights with us. So, I believe that currently he is a director of engineering at BD, at least the last time I spoke to him. So, he has certainly, grew a lot in his career since the conversation we've had. And so, he shares a very interesting, I think, piece of insight with or specifically for engineering leaders who are looking to grow in their career, who are looking to maybe grow within their company. So I'm going to play the clip and we're going to have a short discussion afterwards.
Class, I think, in your senior year, and you talk with the school advisor and they're like, oh yeah, build a plan. And all students, you go through your career planning class, I think, in your senior year, and you talk with the school advisor and they're like, oh yeah, build a plan. And I think everyone should take that really serious, because whether people realize it or not, they're telling you to write a plan for your own life and your success. And a lot of people, I don't think, really take that as serious as probably they should be.
And so, why do I find that clip particularly interesting, right? So, I talk to a lot of engineers who are trying to learn a technical platform, right? So, as you know, I run Solus PLC, and we
Mhm.
teach engineers different technical skills. And I think that the common, not necessarily issue, but I think the common thread I see is that people are struggling to plan a little bit more long term, right? So, I think a lot of us have desires to sort of expand our, I want to say, reach in an organization, but we also want to do more interesting projects. We're looking to take on more responsibility, perhaps. But a lot of times when I have this conversation with engineers, they're looking a little bit more short term. And I think Billy makes a very interesting point is that you should maybe create a timeline. And he explains that in the longer version of that clip, but you should be creating a timeline, 5, 10 years on how you can achieve certain milestones. And if you would like to grow in an organization, what that looks like, right? And so I will also make the comment that it's not always purely on the technical side, right? So there's going to be some soft skills. There's perhaps a way to negotiate your way into taking different assignments. So I think from a career standpoint, his comment is very interesting. Dave, what are your thoughts on that?
I thought Billy's kind of general comment of building a career roadmap and path was very interesting. I think he shared it on the show. I don't remember if it made it into show notes, but I think he had a path kind of, and I think he created the path after his time in the military before he went back to go start getting degrees. Was kind of everything he had done up to that point and everything that he wanted to do, including the major jump that I think he had just made right after we had talked to him on the show. And I thought it was really interesting. I think that Billy is one of those people that is going to go spend the time, going to go put in the work in order to make that career roadmap and career path. I I look at it maybe not as granularly as Billy does, right? So I have a few things that I would like to get done, and typically it's over the course of the next 12 or 24 or 36 months. I think Billy's end goal, and it was as much of a joke as it was serious, was to be like CEO or president of Apple, right? He's like, I think that this would be amazing. So I think that it's certainly good to have goals to strive towards. I think it's certainly good to have goals to strive towards. And if you don't take the time in order to reflect and plan what those goals are, you've got very little chance of succeeding overall. Let me ask you kind of a follow up to that, Vlad. Have you gone through the process of kind of acting or enacting on any of those? Did you sit down? Do you have the next 10, 15, 20 years of what you'd like to do mapped out?
To be honest with you, I have maybe reasonably planned out 2 years ahead, right? And I'm
Mm-hmm.
always, I guess, like I feel that I always play catch up. And the comment that I would make is, once you're, let's say, in a structured program, if you're going through like a bachelor's degree, master's, whatever, in any degree
Mm-hmm.
capacity sort of way, you know that you're going to be there, let's say, 2 to 5 years, for example. And I think it gives you that, how to say it, like longer term view. But once you graduate, it's up to you to set up those goals and achievements, and there is no structure other than the one that you create yourself, right? And so, to answer your question,
Mm-hmm.
I've always had a spreadsheet that I keep up to a certain date. I want to say I review it every couple of months or so. That has like professional and maybe personal goals, but I would say my current horizon has always been that 2 years. I certainly could be doing a little bit better when it comes to that long-term planning.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Are having gone back and listened to the Billy's episode and these clips, are you going to go spend some time this weekend and build out a longer than 2 year career path as to where you want to be in 5 years? Can we come back on episode 110 or 115 and ask you what that's going to look like?
I don't know if I'm going to divulge all the items on my list, but we can certainly
Okay.
check back in and see how the process went because I do plan to revisit my goals list sooner rather than later, for sure.
Perfect. I think that that is fantastic. We will mark it down. So next, I want to go to episode 22. Back with Sam Gupta. So for anyone who doesn't know, Sam is one of my very good friends. He does a lot of work on the ERP side, and I spend a lot of time with him and his show on Thursday afternoons, talking about ERP and digital transformation and how kind of the intersection of those. So here we ask Sam in order to talk to us about what APIs are.
So API is a term designed for salespeople to make it easy so that they can explain how
Sure.
integration works between two systems, to be honest. Okay. And if you are going to ask this question, hey, can the system talk to the other system? They're going to say, hey, I've got APIs.
We can talk to every single system. That's right. It's plug
Right?
and
We have
play.
got APIs, but APIs are supposed to be just the face of the system. Okay. It's not integrated unless you are talking about pre-baked integration. Okay. Then you are going to have the integration that you are going to get out of the box. But you are a programmer, Vlad, yourself. When you write a program, what you need to do is you need to know about each and every line that you have to write in your program. If you don't know that, if those requirements are not defined, you cannot write the program. You cannot test the program either, right? Now, the biggest problem with manufacturing organizations, if you go to any manufacturing shop there, okay, they just don't know their own business. Okay,
Right.
they just don't know their own requirements. In fact, there was a comment in one of the podcasts that we did recently that 40% of the business processes that you might have that nobody will have any clue on. Okay, they will just not know what is happening inside the organization. So the only insight they are going to have is going to be 60%. And by the way, in that 60% is what your sales department knows, your operations department does not know. What your operations department knows, your accounting department does not know.
And so I honestly think that Sam's definition of what an API is might be certainly top 10 funniest moments of the show. And as I was looking back on that, I loved his comments. But Vlad, I'll go kick it over to you. What were your thoughts? What were your thoughts on that?
Look, I certainly resonate with what he's saying. I personally hate the term API, right? Because it's been thrown many times in my face as a means to, or the ability to connect to something without any further context, right? And so what I
Mhm.
mean by that is there is no standard for what an API is, needs to do, or what it might contain. And so I think it's very easy for anyone to throw that word around again without giving any context. So in reality, what happens is every, I think, piece of hardware, most software has an API, right? But the difficulty to connect through that API is left entirely to the user. So it becomes not necessarily, I guess the word would be frustrating to be told there's an API for that and then not necessarily know what's the amount of work or what how does the API even work, right? So
Mhm.
that's why, I laugh in that description, and I certainly agree, and I know that there's a lot of different tools, and I think, the comment that I will make is that on the industrial side, I think that an API is not as standardized as maybe in traditional software. So I think that I've gotten that sentiment that in software it is going to be very well documented. It's going to be in some sort of format. Typically, you can expect like a JSON answer, or maybe it's a function call that you have to make. But
Mhm.
in manufacturing, it just broadens the scope, and so it becomes very difficult and very, I want to say, meaningless to say like there's an API where you don't know what you're trying to connect to or what the information flow is going to be.
Okay. I think it's interesting. I think to kind of some large extent, the definition of an API is helpful in the extent that we have considered how do we integrate these things. To Sam's point and to your point, Vlad, I think that is just, especially in manufacturing and especially when we look at things like ERP, this is just a starting point, right? We're not going to go connect our control system into we're not going to go connect our control system into our ERP through a single API and suddenly we can go find, I don't know, 5, 10, 20,000 fields and they're all magically connected, right? So for me,
Mhm.
hearing that there's an API means that we're thinking, how do we connect these? And generally it's better than when people just kind of shrug and say, people generally have to do one-to-one calls through some sort of middleware which may or may not exist and we may or may not have documented over the course of an integration. So I think we're moving forward. I think APIs are a move in the correct direction, and I think that we're certainly seeing a lot of younger companies, a lot of software based companies moving into our industry. looking at it and saying, yes, we need to have APIs. APIs are standard, and hopefully we've got better payload information. Hopefully we've got better documentation, and that hopefully will get better over the next few years.
Yeah, I would agree. And see, Dante is making a really good comment. So he's
Yeah.
saying that ease of use of an API tends to be proportional to the size of the user base, right? And I think
Mm-hmm.
inherently our industry is fairly small, at least compared to some of the other software industries. And therefore, our APIs are reasonably less documented than, as I said, that you would find in software. So it becomes difficult, right? Like if whenever somebody tells me there's an API for this, I typically assume that there's a protocol that this can talk to over Ethernet or Profinet, whatever that might look like, but nothing else, right? Until I look into the documentation.
Valid.
So next clip, if you want me to move us forward into that, comes from Benson. So Benson spoke to us again. This was almost 2 years ago now on episode 483. Benson is the VP at Opto22, one of our sponsors that month as well. And Benson has a wealth of knowledge when it comes to how control systems came to be, why they are the way we see them in the field, and so he shared a lot of information in that episode, but I wanted to play a clip which I think is very important to, I want to say, today's atmosphere and sentiments towards, Industry 4.0, IIoT, and some of the newer emerging technologies. So let's take a quick listen.
When Ethernet came out, the Ethernet IO product for Opto, and others were doing Ethernet as well, one of the reasons why they said this will never work is because it was only 10 megabits per second. And it worked with a technology called hubs, meaning it was a completely shared medium. Anybody who had access to the wire could communicate. And, that's one of the reasons that people said, well, this will never work. But here's the thing. We knew that there was a lot of research and development in the notion of Ethernet just by itself for IT networks to make them faster, to make them deterministic, to make them everything that we needed them to be. And that's an advantage of in this evolution. If we're adopting technologies that may be outside of our industry and pulling them into our industry and figuring out how that can help solve a problem, the other byproduct of that is we've got these massive companies, Cisco, 3Com, these are companies back in the time that were all about Ethernet. They are investing millions of dollars.
So why I think the comment that Benson makes is really interesting, right? Because I think that in many instances when we have a conversation with a newer technology that is being brought into our space, there's a lot of assumptions that the suggestion might be to roll it out across the floor, immediately rip and replace all of your systems and set this up as the default new way of doing things, right? And I think that it's important to see the distinction between that approach and, hey, we're going to maybe allocate some resources and some efforts in understanding where this might go, what it takes to implement this, so that when the time is right for our specific organization, we can use that technology rather than stay with, I'm going to mention there's some very old PLCs on the production floor, and there's this exponential almost cost curve that is associated with obsolete, at least control systems. But so you get into this maybe tech debt that because your personnel was not trained on newer solutions, they've never took the time. And again, I'm not suggesting that they divert all efforts, but there's a time where you need to put out the fires on the shop floor, and there's a time where, hey, you can maybe tinker with something a little bit different that you might find a use case for. So I really like the way Benson eloquently explained the way Ethernet came to be and the way pushbacks were made against Ethernet technology. And I could tell you again, and Dave, you probably already know this, but there's several protocols that Rockwell developed in response to Ethernet being not fast enough, which were ControlNet and DeviceNet, that could allow you to be a lot more deterministic. But as Ethernet became a lot better through the user base, ultimately now everything pretty much runs on Ethernet, and it's extremely reliable and has become so over the years. What are your thoughts, maybe on what the point that Benson has made, but also on how we're seeing the adoption on some of these different technologies today.
Absolutely. So first, I want to bring the point out that I think Benson has had the best setup of anyone that we've ever talked to, and I think I told him that during the show. Hank down in the comments was saying how the whole Benson episode was a fantastic episode. He watched it live and then he went back to rewatch it. I think that the whole every conversation that I've got to have with Benson over the last handful of years has been amazing. Yeah, absolutely has been amazing. I think that there's an interesting kind of balance between tech debt and everything future looking in our industry, and I think Benson kind of hit that really well, right? So Opto 22 was very much at the forefront of a whole bunch of different of a whole bunch of different solutions, right? And Benson was even telling us how some of them, they knocked out of the park, and how others, they spent a lot of money and a lot of time. And in many other companies, he probably wouldn't be working there anymore because it just didn't work out. So I think that it is the responsibility of the vendors. I think it's the responsibility of the integrators, of the technologists, of the practitioners to go continue to be forward looking and to continue to help and work down the path of we need to provide the best current and or next generation set of technology for when end users are ready to go through the process of upgrading.
Mhm.
As I look at kind of the process of end users upgrading, and Vlad, you know this, and longtime listeners know that I spent a number of years in systems integration and a number of years in distribution before that. I mean, I spent a whole lot of years trying to convince people to upgrade old hardware because it was old and because at some point it would break. And honestly, some of that hardware has been in those facilities as long or longer than I've been alive, especially when we look at some of those old PLC 1s, PLC 2s, PLC 3s floating around, or some of the old original Modicons that you see pictures of every couple of years, right? But they've been floating around longer than many of us, longer than a number of us have been alive. And sometimes it's just hard to go convince people to go make those changes, especially because you very rarely hear about successes, right? I'm sure Vlad has done a number of successful PLC migrations and updates. I have done a number of successful PLC migrations and updates, and you don't hear about those. What you do hear is about the facility that everything was supposed to be ready to go, but maybe we hired the wrong people, maybe we overlooked the planning, maybe we missed some core key components within the BOM, and now the facility is down for 2 or 3 weeks, right? You hear about those stories. You hear about the stories of, hey, we didn't migrate our stuff, and now I just spent $50,000 for the controller cards of a PLC 5 because I have a PLC 5 that is down. Hopefully this thing that I found on eBay is able to go and run my PLC until we get to the point of spending the same amount or maybe less, just completely migrating out of that. So I think it's really difficult, especially when you look at end users, and those end users are very typically in the firefighting process. So I think we need to continue to educate. I think we need to go continue to push different solutions forward. I'll throw out a couple of other guests that we had similar conversations with, and we can go look up the episodes on show notes. We talked to John Detellum from Siemens, talking about that, and kind of he's done a lot of work in automotive, and so looking and working in automotive, his basically best recommendation is when you get to the point of you decide to, or you need to, or you have to go through the upgrade process, and buy the bleeding edge, or as close to the bleeding edge generation of solutions as you possibly can, because you're going to need that to last you for the next 20 or 30 years. And then I'll also throw out Alan Ray. Alan is currently working with Integrate Live. Alan was on, and he was, I think during the episode, I know he's working on it now, but I think during the episode he was talking about how he could actually take like an Opto, how he could take a couple of other things, and for a fairly insignificant price point per IO, go do large scale PLC and PAC in upgrades and implementations. And so I would say also those very good episodes to take a listen to. Do you have any thoughts on those, Vlad? I know I threw a bunch of extra stuff out at you.
I mean, I think we can have an episode on sort of like best practices of systems integration
Mm-hmm.
alone. I think that again, everything comes with a slight risk, right? Like regardless of the decision you make. So you want to minimize the exposure to that risk. And what I mean by that is, let's say you have, 10 production lines running. I certainly, again, I would never suggest to a customer to go rip and replace the entire infrastructure, right? But what I would typically suggest is if you have a new line coming in and you have an engineering team that is fairly capable on the current platform, well, maybe you throw in a few extra $1,000 to allow them to experiment with a different platform, right? And that's necessarily not the easy solution. And perhaps or I guess the worst case would be that they lose a little bit of time, you lose some money, and you have to revert back to the solution you know. But in the best case, if the original manufacturer, if there's any problems, if there's a need to replace those parts, now they have sort of two notches on their belt, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
they understand the nuances of each system. They've gotten a chance to work on a project that, again, had some potential risk. But in my book, that risk has been minimal because you can always go back. And obviously, you should have a plan of how to go back to the original system. And if that's, maybe that's too much risk, then perhaps just buy a couple of controllers or different maybe servo drives or VFDs and put them in a training room. In my opinion, that's going to be a little bit less used than a real life project, but I think it's also an alternative to give the employees or the people working on these systems some exposure to the newer technologies that we've been discussing. And I think a lot of our industry has been in conversation with as a whole.
Absolutely. I will say, Vlad, one of my most favorite things is your desire and demand for everyone to go take their stable hardware software platforms that they've been running for a generation or two and just throw in a whole bunch of new hardware and software. That is
I
just
think
one of
that's the right approach, Dave.
I,
You don't think
and
that's the approach?
I understand that you think that's the right approach. I just love how novel it is compared to everyone else thinking, hey, I've got X platform. I'm going to continue to roll with X platform because it's what brought me here and it's what's going to make me through the rest of my career. I will say only someone who has as many different types of controllers on the board behind them as you currently do, as the technologist side, would be like, hey, I really want 12 different controllers from 8 different companies within my facility.
I mean, look, the comment I will make is that you're not necessarily doing it to have multiple controllers, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think the cutting edge companies of the world in manufacturing have R&D centers, right? And they're
Mm-hmm.
constantly looking to make sure, hey, do we have the latest and greatest? Hey, is there maybe some of the features that we can unlock with a different platform?
Mm-hmm.
Hey, can we upskill our people or at least a portion of the people, right? Like I'm not saying, hey, go send everybody to this specific platform's training, but
Mm-hmm.
again, maybe one full manufacturing line is a big example. Maybe it's a piece of machinery. Maybe it's just a very simple sort of auxiliary piece of machinery that's going to run on that component. But at least getting that understanding
Mm-hmm.
allows you to see what is possible with again some of the newer technologies. Is there a benefit to the business? I think that a real case project is always going to be better than
Mm-hmm.
a test bench, which I wanted to say is second best option in this case. But I think again, the top companies in the
Mm-hmm.
world are having R&D departments that are going to test every single controller.
And I love that, Vlad. And you want to know, I guess, a little bit of behind the scenes for everyone watching who may or may not know. I feel like Vlad always likes to ask the live wire question, right? And my joke is 1,000% of the time we go into a show saying, hey, Vlad, let's not go touch a topic. Vlad, like within the first 15 minutes asks on that topic. So we're going to pull a clip from our safety roundtable with Zach Stank and John Pillar. I think Zach is in the comments. Hey Zach, I warned him that this was going to be at Going into this, I believe the exact comment was, hey, Vlad, let's not start a flame war about what e-stops are and what e-stops aren't. So we're going to go roll the clip.
Question of, do I drop the power at the top of the VFD or at the bottom of the VFD? Who cares? It stops movement of the motor, right? That's the result. Do I drop power at the service entrance of the machine? Stops power, right? It achieves the action. So the purpose of code, the purpose of the NFPA is not to tell you how to engineer it. It's to tell you the minimum requirements for proper craftsmanship.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And I would say, Vlad, that, getting into, because you're talking about two different concepts, is what is required versus how do I design it?
Yeah.
And the design can be very different depending on who you're talking to, and depending on what country you're in, and depending on what customer you're talking to. Because we sell components that go into machines that ultimately get sold to an end user, and they would use them. In the United States, the end user is responsible for the safety of the machine. So by definition, whoever buys the machine is responsible for making sure that it is safe, right? And so the second that it leaves my dock and goes and hits your dock and we complete payment, it is no longer my problem, to worry about how that machine is being used. And that's kind of opposite of the way everyone else in the world sees safety.
And we were actually on the line with Zach a little bit earlier today, and we were talking about, I think, a special that we're going to have talking about the cybersecurity or the Cyber Resilience Act that is coming out and is in process in the EU. And I specifically want to hit on kind of the difference as to the onus of safety, right? So I guess I find it maybe not shocking, but a bit confusing that the end user specifically needs to make sure that their everything, right, their equipment is up to safety standards, especially if they go through the process of paying someone at a systems integration company or a machine builder in order to go through the process of building that. What are your thoughts on that, Vlad? I know that you've gone through a number of builds from the end user perspective.
Yeah, look, I think it's a very interesting conversation. I think that safety is certainly not as covered in our industry, or not as openly discussed as it probably should be. And I think I've made that comment in the past. But look, maybe like to start off, like in my experience, at least like the first job I was at in the manufacturing facility, safety was, number one priority, and they would say it and they would actually live it, right? So to paint you maybe a picture, if you didn't have gloves, right, like gloves that are protecting you from voltage that have been inspected in the last 6 months, you could be immediately walked off the floor, right? If you didn't have your name on a lockout tagout lock, right, like on a physical lock, even though it's locked and you're properly locked out, tagged out, but your name is not on the lock, then you could also be walked off the floor, right? So there's obviously you had to follow every single procedure. You had to have like a face shield if you were opening a cabinet above 50 volts. So there were a lot of safety procedures on the electrical side, but also a lot of safety procedures on the devices, right? So if you were properly, let's say, de-energizing a machine with a key that you were putting into a different sort of slot, then I had a lot of confidence in the design that it would de-energize the proper systems for me to safely access whatever I needed in order to, troubleshoot or maybe work with an operator, explain some of the systems to them. But my point is that once I went to other manufacturing plants, having spent, a number of years at that one, I realized that the safety standards are, I guess the wording I would use is a free for all, but maybe to frame that a little bit different are way worse than what I thought they would be across the industry, right? Like that's kind of like my general sentiment. And so from that experience, I always shied away from, designing safety systems because I know how difficult and intricate they truly are. And even I would be, how to say it, not necessarily fully comfortable putting my stamp of approval to the safety systems that I've seen in the field. And
Mhm.
so a lot of times what this also leads to is that I don't have all the confidence in the world, so I need to double check what's been designed when I lock out, tag out on machine, and I,
Mhm.
either reach inside or decide to work on it. So to bring this back maybe to Zach's and John's conversation, I think that the state of the industry is that there's certainly a lot that can be improved. I understand that the regulations and the ownership off or does fall on the end user of that machine or the end owner of that machine. But the problem is that there's a lot of gray areas. And again, I'm certainly not a lawyer, where if this machine has not been modified, that it followed a standard, from the 1970s that is completely different. So it's easy to, as an engineer, to fall in the trap of, hey, I'm going to assume that this is going to be safe, when in reality, it's not the same level of safety as you would find now. And I guess the last point I would also make is that typically I trust, the OEMs or the providers slash suppliers of those parts to give me the right information, right? So to the conversation we had around like e-stops, my initial reasoning is that if the OEM is labeling that as an e-stop and they are legally supplying within the US, then I can reasonably make the assumption that it is a compliant e-stop. But I guess what I've learned is that may not always be the case. And again, it certainly is something that I would have to look in further to make that assessment. But those are my sentiments when it comes to that conversation.
Absolutely. I am really happy that we got to have that safety roundtable last year. I am confident that we will continue to talk about safety because safety is important. I guess for as many facilities that I've been to that actually preach safety first and are safety first, I have probably been to the better part of 100 facilities that maybe not even talk about safety, or if they do talk about
Right.
safety, it's obvious that safety doesn't actually matter. And so I know that you've talked about those facilities where you can get walked out for doing something, I don't know, stupid. I think those stupid things make it really easy for people to just to literally die, right? And I think
Yep.
that when I look at facilities, when I look at things like that, I feel like we can go so far, right? So we can bend, we can have different conversations so far, but at the point in time in which, hey, someone could actually die, that's when we all have to take a step back. I think I told the story on this show. I was at a couple of facilities last year where I'm like, hey, what you did was really stupid, and then I looked at like chemical compounds and stuff, and I'm like, hey, you might need to go to the hospital. And they're like, oh no, I'm okay. And managers and supervisors were like, oh, maybe we'll look into it. It doesn't particularly matter. And that was the last week I was with those facilities, because I can only say so much, and I don't need it on my conscience or to be there if someone were to do something really bad and die. So I think that it is all relative. I actually like the names or pictures of people on the lockout tagout locks. That way you know who to go find if something is
Yep.
is locked out. I was at a facility, I think end of last year. Someone had locked out what they thought was the whole cell, but then someone else went to go move a different part of like the cell next to that, and the person in the cell almost got hit by a robot because how we designed it may or may not have been to appropriate specifications, and lockout tagout of what should have been the cell didn't actually work. That person got walked off the site for good, as they very well should be.
Yeah, exactly. And look, I think we probably all have, different horror stories on the safety side, and we can make it an entire, separate roundtable as well.
Mhm.
Maybe a comment that I will make is that for a control systems engineer who understands, safety circuits, it's fairly straightforward to make them to their design, right? But that doesn't mean that they should be creating the design. And that also means that somebody should be validating that design with the appropriate knowledge. And maybe the story that I will tell is that I remember I had this palletizing project which involved a massive Fanuc robot that was stacking these large boxes onto a pallet. And I remember the manager that was leading that project had asked me to add a bypass for the light curtains, that were going to be used to walk into that cell so that they could service it faster whenever, the pallet would spill. They wouldn't have to reset the robot because obviously, if you disconnect the safeties, a lot of time that kind of drops the robot where it's at and it de-energizes it the right way, so to speak, right? And obviously, it's very easy to work with these circuits. I think they're making them a little bit more complicated. I know, at least on the guard logics line, they've introduced this. It's really interesting, actually. They do like pulses instead of straight 24-volt signals. I don't know if you've ever implemented or looked at those data sheets, but they created so that it's pulsed between different devices, and the configuration cannot just be rewired in the field, right? But the traditional 24-volt safety, it's very easy to just add two jumpers between a number of devices, and you're pretty much ready to go. That way, it's locked out like on the software side as well. And if it senses a misconfiguration or rewiring, it's going to lock you out. But the point I'm trying to make is that it's very easy to design and bypass the system, and I've seen a lot of those sort of like weird requests. And I think it's very important as the industry to step away from projects like that and be very firm in saying like, no, we're not going to implement a bypass that's going to put somebody's life in danger, even though technically it's not that difficult, right? But it's and to be honest with you, I don't even know if there's I know that there's code obviously that governs this, but I certainly did not have the knowledge of those codes at the time, and I just said like, no,
Mm-hmm.
this is not something we can do. But I can tell you
Absolutely.
that those conversations happen elsewhere, and the answer is like, yes, we will add a bypass, and this system is going to be amazing.
Yeah. Bypasses always the word bypass always starts to worry me, as I feel like it should worry everyone. I will make one comment. I really like those light curtains replacing panels, replacing kind of plexiglass that we see covering machines. I think they're really slick, especially if you have to get in and out of different sides of machines. I've seen a number of them over the last few years, and honestly, as I think about the relatively inexpensive cost of light curtains and the relatively inexpensive cost of probably code into already existing PLCs, etc., it makes me wonder how much more expensive they could possibly be over plexiglass, because thick, large pieces of plexiglass are expensive and difficult to clean, and all of these other things. And so it makes me wonder when and if we will see more kind of newer machines built like that, or if there are any machine builders in the comments or anything like that. Would love to hear if you are seeing more of those requirements. Before, well, I'm sorry, go ahead, Vlad.
I was just gonna make the comment. I think that the only trade-off, right, is if you do break that pane of, of a light curtain, you do shut down in the machine,
Mm-hmm.
typically in a not so predictable way, and
Yep.
depending on what you have in those, cabinets, it
Mm-hmm.
may cause some electrical issues, right? But
Yeah.
a plexiglass, you physically cannot walk into it, so
Yeah,
it really
plexiglass.
depends. I guess.
Yes, no, I guess I've worked on a number of machines, especially in like food and beverage, when you have to get in a lot of well, I guess I've seen them on palletizers, but I'm also seeing them on like tray packers and plastic wrap and other machines, especially machines that multiple times every shift you've got to get in, or in some cases multiple times every 20 or 30 minutes you have to get in order to go fix something, or easier for changeovers and other reasons. As long as you're not going to mechanically or electrically break things, if you can move away from the plexiglass and the pop up and out and all of those things into something along the lines of light curtains. The light curtains that I've seen that have been retrofit have a number of stops. I don't know if they're technically e-stops or otherwise. I'll let John and let John and Zach jump in and tell me if they should technically be e-stops and which type of e-stops they should be. But they've got stops, and they've got a fair number of them, and you can just go push them. Or I suppose most of them are a combination of stops, and then they've also got reset buttons there in order to in order to do that. Before we move to the next segment, I wanted to make a comment. I guess I wanted to thank a bunch of kind of our longtime sponsors at Phoenix Contact. I wanted to thank a bunch of our longtime sponsor at Siemens, and then we've had a number of groups over the last, I guess, hundreds or so episodes now who have come in and sponsored us and helped to drive some really awesome and an interesting engagement. So we want to go and we want to thank all of those groups for doing that. I will say when Vlad and I started out, this was not necessarily our intent. We've got a bunch of great industry partners happy to come help drive the production quality, the back end work, and hopefully the conversations for you guys, the listeners, even better than we were doing starting around episode, I don't know, 20 or 30 when that started. So we certainly want to say thank you guys. We are certainly interested to go continue to work along these conversations. If you guys, the listeners, have thoughts upon conversations or themes that you'd be interested in us having, please feel free to let us know. And I will throw it out there if there are any groups interested in coming to go put a theme together with us. We've got some really cool ideas and are always listening and are always happy to listen to what you guys are thinking as well.
Awesome. No, that sounds really good. The next clip, Dave, is from Shane Dittrich conversation. Dittrich, I believe that is the way you pronounce his last name. Episode 54. So Shane started an integration company that focused on robotics. The point that I wanted to bring, or the discussion I wanted to bring, is around, starting to productize a service company. And I think that's a very interesting transition. I certainly think that it's a very difficult one, and he will make a few good points based on that. So let's listen to the clip, and we can have a discussion.
In XYZ company, they want all Allen Bradley, and they want all, they have their list of preferred vendors that they want us to use. Well, we would always try to stick to our preferred vendors, which would be ABB. Like, we've never integrated any other robot than ABB, but, so you kind of bounce around as a system integrator, trying to ebb and flow in between these customers on custom systems, right? And you got to be flexible on that because some want something different than somebody else. When you go to standardization, well, boy, that's a different world.
So the clip cuts a little bit short. So he makes a point following that, on how to implement different standards and how to balance between standardizing and remaining flexible with your customers, which I think, again, is a challenge that a lot of systems integrators face. And we've certainly had a number of them come and talk to us on the manufacturing hub. I think that it's a very, I keep saying very difficult transition, but a very interesting one as well, right? So as you are what I want to say, like a rogue warrior, you go on site and you are going to be helping or being, first of all, billing by the hour you're working on whatever system is thrown at you. I think your ultimate goal is to find ways to productizing, I guess, is a, I want to say, a very loosely defined term, but you want to find ways to reapply what you've done at a customer to other customers, right? So if you found value, for example, in building a system that allows you to extract data and then showcase, for example, something as simple as OEE, and you're able to be that single bundle that leverages, a couple of technologies to present that, then you can take that component and bring it to other customers. And I guess I was also wondering, Dave, like on your side, what are your thoughts on, again, going from consulting work to productizing? But I also want to dive into a few other topics that Shane had discussed with us on that episode.
Absolutely. So I think my background and experience with taking service-based offerings and turning them into products are probably different than most people. I think that as a general rule, I'm a big fan. I think that if you do something well and you have a number of people who ask you to do the same thing over and over again, you can take that service and you can turn it into a product. And I think you should turn it into a product. I guess in my experience, it is a little bit more upfront time But if you turn that and you build it into a module, if you take an SDK of some sort of platform and go kind of build it off of that, or even if you just have a repository of code that you use over and over again, you have a product. As to if you're selling it as a product and gaining dollars off of the IP that you have into that product, or you're selling it as a service, those are two different questions. So generally speaking, I think that if you have a number of people that ask you to go build something or do something or something very similar over and over and over again, you have a very easy opportunity to take a, hey, we can do anything for you service. Say we focus on these three things. As to if we want to call them products, if we want to call them services, almost doesn't matter. But if you get known for one somethings or a number of somethings similar to what Shane has been doing with what they were doing with House of Design and the robotics. And he went in on that episode talking a little bit more specifically about a number of things that they were focusing on. I think it was 2 or 3 or a handful of applications to do that. I think it's very good, and honestly, more people should move into that. What are your thoughts on that, Vlad? I know that you have a couple of other topics that you want to bring into that.
Yeah, I guess I to some degree agree with your points on productizing. I think it's an interesting leap, but like I said, I think it's a very difficult one, and I think that it certainly needs to lend itself to the market. I think if you find something that is easy to bundle, I think would be difficult for me to say, but is bundleable, right? If you can reapply it from one customer to the other, but also if you have a number of customers that are looking for that product, which again could be a challenge. But I think it's an interesting branch. But in any case, the other point, with Shane, I think we discussed robotics fairly extensively. So he comes from primarily a robotics company, as he mentioned. They worked extensively on ABB robots, and so with robotics, at least currently, the interesting trend is robots as a service, or machine as a service. I think we've seen a number of cells come out from Bright machines that leverage robotics. So I was wondering, what your thoughts were on that model. And I think we've talked a few episodes before on machine as a service, but I think it's worth maybe revisiting that just very briefly.
Absolutely. Vlad, I feel like it's almost like you read the show notes and knew what was coming up next. So we're actually going to have one of the folks from Brent Machines, Adam Montoya, come on and talk about what it was to reshore the Mac for Apple. And we will go ahead and talk about that. We'll go ahead and talk about that next. But your question to me was machine as a service, robot as a service. I think a couple of things. One, I absolutely am willing to recommit to do at least another robotics theme at some point in the course of 2023. I think we had a great time doing it last year. And then having talked to a whole bunch of robotics people past that, I think that there are huge opportunities to talk and continue to talk about robotics. Beyond robotics, I'm a big fan of robot as a service or machine as a service. I think that there are very particular applications in which works or doesn't work for them. I think if you have the word fortune before any number, be it 50 or 5,000 or 10,000, you're probably not the target market for robot or machine as a service. I think if you're a small to medium sized organization, call it maybe sub $500 million a year, then there are certainly opportunities to go leverage robotics or machine as a service, especially if there are positive contractual opportunities for you guys. And if you don't have the necessary cash flow or the desire or ability to go get a bank loan for something like that, or maybe the interest rates are going up and it's cheaper to go rent the thing, take the tax write-offs for renting or leasing the machine, and then move beyond that. And then I would say kind of to the small and medium side, so single digit millions up through maybe $100 or $200 million a year. I think that there's really real opportunity, especially when we look on fairly standard items. So when I talk about standard items, my most favorite item to talk about are palletizers, Vlad. I don't know if I've worked with a single organization who said, Dave, I love my palletizer. You can change everything about what we have. You can go change out all the employees. I want my palletizer. No, palletizers are generally pains in the butt. They are generally exceptionally repetitive. They are generally fairly low stress. And even in fairly high production, high numbers of cases, they typically don't have to move super fast. And so I think because of a number of these things, it's a good opportunity to leverage something along the lines of a palletizer in order to say, hey, can I go rent this? Or, hey, I could really use a new palletizer. It's going to be 8 or 18 months in order to get mine. Can I go buy a mostly off the shelf application? And by buying a mostly off the shelf application, be able to leverage that into getting it quicker, even if it costs me a little bit more in the long run.
Yeah, and I think what we agreed on in our last conversation about robot slash machine as a service. We would love to have someone who could maybe explain to us the financials or some of those deals a little bit better. So if you are one of those people, if you know one of those people, definitely would be interested in having a conversation, because I think it all comes down to whether it is worth for your organization to go that route. And I certainly am not as familiar with what those deals look like, but we would be very happy to have that conversation on the manufacturing hub.
Absolutely. I actually have a person. Whenever we come
Good.
to robotics, his name is also Dave, which will always make for interesting conversations. But moving away from that, I want to go talk. So episode 61, Adam Montoya from Bright Machines, we're coming in. So if you guys don't know Bright Machines, they make a lot of kind of very modular cells that are really easy to go change what they're doing. So they focus especially on the consumer electronic. So their cycle is a little bit different. Like if you think of iPhones, right? So basically once a year, you are completely changing all of the lines to run the iPhone. And you're going to run like crazy for 9 or 10 months. And then you've got a couple of months worth of changeover. And then you're going to run like crazy for 9 or 10 months. So they make super make super flexible offerings for that. And so here Adam gave one of like the most interesting one of the most interesting stories he had. He was part of the team that helped Apple reshore the Mac Pro from I think either the most recent generation or it might have been the trash can Mac. I don't remember which one they started making in the US. But hang out with us for 3 or 4 minutes. We've got a really good clip and a great story from Adam.
Originally somebody inside of the Apple ecosystem said, we really want to understand what it would take to actually reshore something. We want to know how hard it is. And we'll talk, the subject matter that you guys wanted to discuss was like, how do you do it? How do you accelerate it? I'll tell you kind of the story of what they went through. And they have unlimited resources and incredibly smart people. If you think that they're smart, if you haven't had the opportunity to work with them, brace yourself. But they went on this journey and said, let's figure out if this is feasible. And they looked at their product portfolio and said, all right, what is going to be, lower risk? You could never have even pitched the idea of the phone. At that point in the time, the phone was selling more units in one day, and I don't know the figures, but Gartner does. They were selling more of those phones in one day than the entire year of the desktop. And it wasn't to say that the desktop didn't sell well. That was to say that the phone was just incredibly high volume. And so they picked one and they said, okay, well, we've got to figure out the supply chain first. And I think somebody from manufacturing ops probably said, no, you've got to figure out manufacturing ops first. And then somebody from test said, do we even know how to make fixtures in the Americas anymore? So they had to go figure it all out. Mm-hmm. What people do when they're trying to go onshore, the smart thing to do is to either hire a partner, so a contract manufacturer that has a footprint in the Americas, And that short circuits half of it, right? Because they know the process, the tooling, the supply chain, the trade routes. They've already kind of got that stuff. And I think that, you know, I don't know what Tim's long game is, but I don't think that they wanted to stand up another factory, right? I don't think that they wanted to own that. It's a huge pain to manage, right? So I think that they really wanted to be experts in managing supply chain and supplier management. So they partnered with you know, a world-class contract manufacturer, and they said, okay, you guys know how to do this manufacturing process. You don't exactly know our manufacturing process, but we're going to come teach you, and you know, somewhere in the middle we'll find a happy medium. And it was good and very, very painful. And I'll tell you why it was painful was because they were so used to working in China, and the workforce is very different between China and Texas. So the first thing was, you know, figuring out what the labor model would support. And so we knew basically it was a spreadsheet exercise that to be cost competitive, we had to reduce this percentage of the labor. And it was at the time, it was a comically high percentage. It was like, that's not possible. And as a team, you know, both the customer and the service provider side, we said, this is where we have to get to. And we have to mechanize a ridiculously high percentage. And we set off and made multiple work streams to do this. And it took us about a year. And it was a really interesting project in that we stood up a factory. We brought in engineers. I had an army of folks. There were 500 people hired for this. And nobody knew what was going on. Like there was like skunk works turned up to 11. The level of secrecy that those guys are able to maintain is unlike anything I had ever seen before. And I think I had like a personal NDA that, you know, I'm not allowed to talk about. This was years ago, so I can talk about it now. But they kind of said, don't tell anyone. And ultimately, the slip up came from a planning and zoning official who was approving the inspection, and they like put it on a memo who it was going to be to support. And so that's how the world found out that Apple was trying their hand at U.S. manufacturing again.
I love that, Vlad. I think that was one of my most favorite stories that that we listened to. What are your thoughts? Have you had the opportunity to work with any groups? I know there are lots of groups talking about doing some reshoring. Have you worked with any or many groups looking to do that, and then realizing that they don't have the internal capabilities to understand what's going on?
No, I have not, worked at those levels. I think that those decisions are certainly, made maybe at the highest level of organizations. And having been in engineering teams in very, very large companies, I've not had the opportunity maybe to look at those opportunities. I've heard many conversations around reshoring, and I've certainly maybe had questions on the technical challenges and the personnel challenges, but I've not necessarily worked through such a large assignment as the Apple project that Adam was describing. So I think it's very interesting, and I certainly can appreciate probably the level of work that went into that, and not only on the technical side, but also on the, I want to say, on the human side, which I think has been probably a very big undertaking. But yeah, I can only relate, I guess, to the stories. How about you, Dave?
I have certainly worked with a number of groups that at some point realized that they no longer had the internal engineering capability to do projects, and it's a bit surprising, right? At first, it's a bit off-putting, and then they bring on a bunch of contractors. Maybe they bring on a bunch of consultants or consultants who were former employees, and watching the brain drain that I've seen from a number of facilities is, I don't know, to some extent shocking. Watching a lot of knowledge transfer go away is a bit crazy. And honestly, I think that a lot of facilities are going to be to that point of Adam's conversation in the next handful of years, especially if they let people retire without the opportunity to go through and capture that knowledge, without the opportunity to go through and capture that knowledge. But I would say Adam's entire conversation is great. You guys should absolutely go check out episode 61 with Adam Montoya. And I will, as a fun fact, say that there is a golden nugget in there for any of you sneakerheads out there. I think Adam is like an absolute closet sneakerhead where he's talking about how it is known that some groups make sneakers, like some factories or some days of the week, the sneakers will just be better than other days. And we also talked about hyper local manufacturing, which I thought was absolutely interesting. Which I thought was absolutely interesting. You guys should absolutely go ahead and check that out.
Sweet. Next clip. So clip number 4 on my end. So we have Rob Tiffany, very interesting personality. So he posts quite extensively on LinkedIn. Very knowledgeable guy. Shares a lot of his thoughts on automation, IoT, Industry 4.0. So we had a very long discussion around cloud. I want to play the clip before I reveal the conversation we're about to have after this clip.
Cloud IoT players were late to the party with industrial. They did baby steps, and we're probably doing more consumer looking things, or what I would say is also greenfield scenarios where you're doing something from scratch. I'm building an IoT toaster or a pump or a whatever, and it's got communications built into it to do that. But industrial is harder because of all those ridiculous protocols and serial ports hanging out everywhere, and PLCs and HMIs and MESs and a million other things all entrenched.
So I think the comment again relates maybe to something we've discussed a little bit earlier, but I think the common misconception is that when you suggest going to the cloud is that we need to necessarily pull everything we've got and create controls on the cloud, pull all the data in the cloud. I think that the conversation is more around what kind of technologies the software or the IT space has been using for the last, decade now. I want to say that the cloud has really been adopted that can be reapplied to manufacturing. And I remember there was a post recently on LinkedIn where somebody said, well, the cloud is only cost effective in, when you have very sporadic loads or when you have a very specific compute scenario that you need to address that you can only do with some of the services that the cloud providers have. And my response or my approach to I guess that comment is that I think that as an engineer or as someone who works with technology, I want to be less restricted by what is available, right? And so I've certainly, I don't know what your experience has been on the IT side, but I've been in projects where it takes, 6 months to get the server hardware at the facility installed. And that's just perhaps for a project that is large enough to even warrant that equipment in the first place, right? And so the advocacy that I'm making for cloud is, hey, I want to do a proof of concept. Hey, I want to try out this new way of gathering data. Hey, I want to see if the link is even possible to be made to collect our data into this hypothetical database. And then once we scale that to a certain point, I also understand that financials are maybe better to have on-prem, but perhaps there's other services again that we can leverage in the cloud that allow us to do different things on the manufacturing side. And I think again that conversation or that discussion around cloud is sometimes misunderstood. I certainly am, trying to push for us to try these maybe very ambitious ideas, but I think it's in the hopes that we get to see what is the limiting factor and readjust accordingly, right? For actual continuous operations. What are your thoughts, Dave?
I think you bring up some good points, Vlad. I will say that for anyone listening, we're going to have an episode 101 actually tomorrow, in which we kind of go over and talk about IT/OT convergence, and I'm sure cloud and cloud services will be a major topic of conversation. So, having said that, I think cloud services are here to stay. I think in the last handful of years, we've seen the Googles, we've seen the Amazons, we've seen the Microsofts with Google Cloud Platform, Azure, and AWS go through the process of investing a lot of time and a lot of money in cloud services for manufacturing. I think most of those have generally been pulled back for a whole bunch of reasons, including manufacturing just doesn't move that quickly on technology adoption, as well as the fact that manufacturing isn't gonna go all in on an untested and unknown series of products. So having said that, I think cloud is here to stay. I think the adoption will only continue to be more and more. I see a number of cloud first solutions that have on prem options. And while I am generally happy to leverage some cloud services, at the end of the day, there are not insignificant numbers of organizations that have a facility or a number of facilities that just don't have good cellular reception, don't have the ability to don't have the ability to have a good internet connection. So a number of years ago, I looked at a series of water wastewater plants. It was as a special request to a vendor that I've done a lot of work with, and so I went out there and I talked to them, and we were talking about what's going on. And they have one of their two facilities that is miles away from the nearest fiber, and literally there is a drainage ditch that runs under the that is like an underpass for a major highway that blocks that from basically good cellular connectivity, and there is basically no signal. The best signal they get is bounced off of about 3 repeaters, and it works about 60 or 70% of the time. So that's just one of those that at the end of the day, there is no way you're going to be able to leverage a solution that is not an on-prem solution. So I think that there are positives, that there are pluses and minuses. And my general prediction and general trend is we will see more cloud services. We will see more IoT style services in the cloud because people are going to be forced to adopt them if they want to leverage a bunch of these tools.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, it's giving again your engineers the freedom to experiment with different ways of doing things. And like I said, by no means am I saying rip and replace, but I'm just saying that and I'll give maybe like a story, right? I think I've mentioned them on one of the episodes, but it's a company that does these brew can packaging. So they have like the sprinter, and they can spray paint a can in any design that you would like, which is different from, low volume manufacturers traditionally use like a paper sleeve that you would put on top of so you would
Mhm.
glue a sleeve on the can. And so what they've shown me is the application which allowed the customers to automatically upload, their designs through their website, and then that would automatically send a work order to the production floor and ultimately even change the way like that machine would run depending on the can size and the image for the PLC, right? Like, so
Mhm.
that would be streamlined all the way to the PLC level. But they explained to me that earlier on they didn't have that many orders, they didn't need an intricate system, so they spun up, a very basic EC2 instance in AWS, and they're able to make that connection with a single application. And as they scale, they're like, well, now we have like an ERP system that's able to
Mhm.
collect some of that information that allows us to plan and process that information a little bit better. To bring this back to our earlier conversation, it has an API, and now this application goes into the API of the ERP. It's able to cross talk together. It now has a better cybersecurity level, right? So there's maybe a load balancer as well that kind of acts as a firewall and sends the traffic to the right place. And ultimately, I don't think that would have been cost effective for them to say, hey, we need a server on prem for $50,000 to be deployed for this initial project. They would have just immediately said no, like, hey, this is not cost viable. Let's come back when we have a larger system. And so again, I think your example of industries not having connectivity is correct, right? But I
Mhm.
think in many other instances, a server or a setup that's going to be on prem is cost prohibitive from engineers to do these smaller tests of newer technologies and sort of simplifying the end user's life to an extent, right? And again, some projects will fail, as you know. Some projects will succeed. I think it's a learning opportunity. Sometimes you overrun your cloud provider's bill, and you have to pay a huge premium on that. But that's an entirely different, I think, discussion.
Yeah, I think that proof of concept, I think that we will see more and more proof of concept. And as we look at proof of concept, I think software as a service style solutions, I think cloud-based solutions allows us to, for very little big chunks of money, go try things. And if we're trying things in production, or if we're trying things on test benches to see if it works, to look if it goes in production, I think all of those are kind of valuable paths forward. What I do know is that IoT, IIoT, and kind of all sorts of these cloud and SaaS-based solutions are going to allow people to test more things at a much quicker rate. And or especially for application style solutions, probably get some free trials if that's what you really need in order to test some things out. But I want to take a hard left about as far as one can get from cloud-based solutions and I'm going to go kick it over to Tim Wilborn, and we're going to talk about ladder logic.
That's probably the number one comment I get. Well, it's not a hater comment. It's still a constructive comment. And, you know, it's interesting is I actually got in, when I got into this industry, you know, the company that Dad was working with, their big thing was they were here to replace the PLC. It was the next generation. I think we've heard that quite a bit even today. Same thing. It was 1998, 1999. And yeah, this is gonna replace the PLC. And here we are, 20 some years later, yep, this is gonna replace the PLC. And here's my argument with everybody that's like, oh, you shouldn't be teaching ladder logic, is if all the automation companies got together today and said, we're banning ladder logic from all of our controllers that are shipped from today on, then the majority of the equipment you got to work on is still ladder logic for the next 20 years.
Vlad, tell us how much you hate ladder logic now.
I wouldn't say that I hate ladder logic. I think I've just worked on a number of applications that should not have been written in ladder logic, and I was to some extent pigeonholed by the customer's requirements to do it in ladder logic, right? I think that's I look, I don't want to say like I'm completely language agnostic, because I think that ladder logic lends itself extremely well to the electrical diagrams that we've developed a lot in the past, and I think it makes a lot of things very simple, right? So I can pick up ladder logic, and by following what's going on my electrical schematics, I can very easily understand PLC code. I think that there's also something to be said that in traditional software, you have a lot more possibility, which is on one side a curse, but on one side a blessing, on the other side a curse, right? So it's very easy to create more custom software in, let's say, structured text or like a traditional programming language. I'm not saying it's not possible to do the exact same thing in both. I think it is. It's just easy to have these different tangents that you can go on. So I certainly have a positive experience with ladder logic, but I would say that some projects were a little bit more extensive than I would like, and could have been done better if they were not in ladder logic.
I would agree, and I think maybe more importantly, that was kind of the lead up comment that Tim had as well, right? Like he is not he is able to program, is able to use a bunch of different programming languages. He is not solely into writing everything in ladder logic, as which is probably different than probably many people. I think there are many people who have learned to write things in ladder logic and write everything in ladder logic. Vlad, I think that you've talked about people that you've worked with in the past who are like really good at writing things in ladder logic and did entire batch processing and all of this other stuff in ladder, which doesn't make sense to anyone else. Well, it doesn't make sense why they would spend the time to one, write it in a PLC or two, write it in ladder in a PLC, but it was done. So I think it's a powerful tool that most people will agree is a fairly powerful tool, but there are certainly potentially better tools for the job. I do like to listen to Tim talk, and I think I have mentioned that quote a whole bunch of times over the show. Whenever we've got a guest or whenever we get to the point of potentially bashing ladder logic, is hey, you know, ladder logic may not be the best programming language that we can use, but what it is probably going to be around, maybe more so than anything else for the rest of our career. So if nothing else, we at least have to understand what ladder logic is.
Yeah, I would agree. So the next conversation we had with Grant, and that was not as long ago with some of the other guests. That was episode 82. So that was last fall during Cybersecurity Awareness Month in October. So this episode was sponsored by Phoenix Contact, and we talked a lot about industrial cybersecurity. Grant made a lot of interesting points, but ultimately, I want to bring his, I want to say concerns, but his also non-concerns on the PLC side, and you'll see what I mean in the clip. So I'm going to play it, and we can have a discussion on cybersecurity.
Yeah, if you're talking ransomware, it's going to be low-hanging fruit because all they're trying to do is create the ransomware malware that can affect the most systems to get the most impact and get the most return on that ransom. So if they can encrypt a bunch of PCs that are critical to operations and they ask for $2 million in ransom, then that's fine enough for them. We haven't really seen ransomware for PLCs yet. I know Pascal mentioned that in the closing comments about ransomware for PLCs.
So a very interesting, final comment from Grant, which I think is, how to say it, very appropriate for the events that have happened over the last 2 years. I think we've seen a lot of increase, or at least, how to say, more awareness around cybersecurity. Certainly in the traditional software and IT spaces, and I know that a lot of funds are being poured into those verticals. But I think on the industrial side, we're also seeing not necessarily the same level or the same number of attacks, but we've seen a lot of interesting companies start to develop better cybersecurity, I want to say software tools and best practices on the manufacturing side. And I think Dragos is a very important company name to mention. I think they started off as initially they were mapping the industrial space, but now they are providing cybersecurity solutions for the industrial manufacturer. But maybe to bring this back, what are your thoughts, Dave, on the state of cybersecurity in our industry today?
So I will say, in a word, Vlad, I think scary, right? I think, in a word, the state of cybersecurity in our industry is scary. I think Grant brought up a bunch of good points. Before I get to them, I will say, if you guys want to listen to 4 of the most horrific downer predictions, go back and listen to the October ICS Cybersecurity Awareness Month conversations. Oh my goodness. Are those 4 shows that make you want to just press the next button around the point in time that I ask what sort of predictions do they look like? But I think Grant brings up a bunch of really good points. And I think they all bring up very good points as cybersecurity experts. From that side, I think that as long as you are not the lowest hanging fruit, right? As long as you are not going and putting yourself out there, and as long as you don't have open ports for your PLCs, for your industrial control systems, as long as you don't show up on Shodan, you're probably not the lowest hanging fruit. Like the guys next to you on both sides of your industrial on both sides of your industrial parks probably are doing things that are going to get themselves hacked or ransomware much easier than whatever you're doing. So with that, I think as long as you don't make yourself an easy target, you're probably going to get by 95% of the time. As I think Pascal kind of made a very interesting comment about air gap systems, right? So we talk about air gap, and we'll talk a little bit more about air gap on episode 101. But he talked about air gap systems, and man, if you really want to get into a system, you can go find a way to go hack a computer that is not connected to the internet. Be you dump a whole bunch of USB drives and someone eventually plugs in, and boom, you can go ahead and get into that. There are like IR and other hacking capabilities through Windows and stuff like that. That again, if you need to, stay awake while you're driving late one night, go listen to all 4 of those episodes, because there are certainly some things that will keep you up at night, talking about ICS cybersecurity. So I think that we can all be as secure as we can, as we want. I think that you have to mitigate as many risks as you possibly can. But I think at the end of the day, you have to assume some risk. I think it was just LastPass and a couple of other password groups I just saw in the news again yesterday, who were in the news because someone like copied master vault encryption keys and brought it home, and their home was hacked or their home was broken into, and the master encryption keys were stolen. So some pretty crazy stuff. What are your thoughts in regard to that, Vlad?
I would make, a slightly, not necessarily different, but a parallel comment that I've certainly learned quite a bit from our conversations around cybersecurity.
Mm-hmm.
And I have certainly changed the way I perceive things from the OT side, at least,
Okay.
right? Versus maybe before I was a lot more, how to say, like open about putting in a quick patch. And now I've realized that it's a lot more intricate than I thought it was. And I think
Okay.
that the risks are a lot greater than I thought they were. And so I'm certainly a lot more careful with what I suggest or how I approach, some of the. And again, I think like during the pandemic, we've seen a lot more of, at the very least, solutions that allow you to remote into a site. And I think that in the past, I would have been fine with like, hey, like let's drop a laptop in that has TeamViewer or some kind of like a VPN access. But now I've realized that it's not that simple, and I think that the systems can be compromised a lot easier than I thought through the conversations we've been having. Right, so
Okay.
that's the general comment I will make. I don't know if I have a negative outlook, but I certainly think that we need a lot more cybersecurity slash IT expertise on the OT side. And I know that we've talked with Josh Varghese specifically, but I think he's more like on the network side, right? So he understands industrial networks extremely well. I think it would be good, or I think in the next couple of decades, we'll see a lot more cybersecurity experts work on the OT side and be able to sort of not necessarily capitalize on the need, but I want to say provide the right technology for the industry that needs them, and sort of provide the right frameworks also, and be that kind of tie in between IT OT.
Okay. I think the industry certainly needs to make some moves. Let me follow up, Glad. You mentioned Dragos a few times, almost every time we talk about ICS cybersecurity. What's your love story with Dragos? Are you using their software? Do you know those guys? Why do you continue to mention Dragos? I feel like that we are building up to something here.
I, to be honest with you, know nothing about them besides what I've read on the website, and I followed a couple of people that I think from some of our even sponsors went to work for Dragos and had a really good experience. I think that what they're doing, at least from what it seems from my side, looks extremely interesting, but I certainly don't have much more than that.
Okay. Full stack ICS cybersecurity, right there, Vlad. We'll have to get you connected with some of these Dragos people so that you can go
I
take a
think so too.
demo, and so you can go get a demo, and then the next time you talk about ICS cybersecurity, and you bring up Dragos, you can have some high points of conversation with
Good.
that. But speaking of high points, as we look at what is the last clip to go end out episode 100, we might have a couple of closing comments after this, but man, it's really difficult to go with anyone other than Arlen Nipper. Arlen Nipper, episode 67. I hands down think that Arlen has the best demo in industry. We've got a live build coming up at the end of March. Stay tuned for some official announcements when it comes to that. But Arlen has the best demo when it comes to MQTT. I saw it a number of years ago. I heard it gets even better. Where he goes kind of opens and builds an entire ignition system with UDTs, something like 50,000-60,000 tags, and then I think he hits the transmit button, and then he goes and he builds a digital twin in AWS, something along those lines. So I will say, if you are interested in MQTT, absolutely reach out to Arlen over at Cirrus Link. But I know that there has been talk that Vlad and I only ask the easy questions. Here, we're asking Arlen, well, I guess I'm asking Arlen a bit of a difficult question when it comes to MQTT. MQTT is coming up on 25 years old. That is fairly legacy, age-wise. Is MQT at some point going to be looked at in the short term as a legacy solution, or were you guys perhaps 20 years ahead of your time and you have built a spec and a solution that the rest of the world is now ready to go ahead and leverage?
Well, it was fairly obscure until about 6 or 7 years ago. So
yes.
It kind of was. It lived at the layer of IBM, consulting services, right? So, yeah, you're right. I mean, really, I think it's the realization of what TCP/IP can do what TCP/IP does, what cloud computing can do, what networking can do, and I think it all came together in a perfect storm of MQTT just popped up, and geez, that's kind of simple, isn't it? And so I think if I put an age on it, I would say, yeah, Andy and I were ahead of our time in that. Again, there was no notion of the Internet of Things. There was no notion of cloud. TCP/IP was just emerging. So I think it sat there in obscurity for a very long time before something popped out. Now, you and Vlad asked me before, there's OPC-UA, there's MQTT and Sparkplug. I don't see anything else coming out right now. I mean, I would love to, I'm a propeller head. I'd love to figure out what new things are out there. But right now, I think there's a ton of really cool applications. And we take, like the PLC manufacturers, if I'm going to do a really small compact sensor, right? My overhead, if you look at the MQTT spec, the original one that Andy and I did, it was 18 pages long. 18 pages. I mean, typically when I'm working with OEMs that are trying to do MQTT, they may not have all the kinks worked out, like you said, Vlad, but they probably can get a client up and running in a day.
So what are your thoughts on MQTT, Vlad? Have you used it much, more than in the last 2 or 3 years? I know you've used it a little bit. What are your thoughts on MQTT? Spec that we are only going to continue to see more of, or spec that maybe we talk more about than we see in the field?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting protocol, and this goes back to the comment somebody made in chat earlier, which is, I think it's gaining traction through the user base, and it's becoming better and better. There's a number of vendors that now support and provide, cloud MQTT servers, and there's a number of them. And I think that the protocol is certainly fairly easy to use, right? So I've done a few projects on it. It's not extremely complicated to figure out. I think it's also the methodology of publish and subscribe versus, the poll response that you would get with OPC-UA. However, I still think that both are viable, right? And depending on how you engineer or how you write software, I don't necessarily see that there's a huge bottleneck or a, maybe like 10x advantage in either one,
Mhm.
unless there's specific kind of edge cases, right? And I think Arlen discussed or you mentioned that the demo he does is, 20,000, 30,000 tags. I think that MQTT can automatically discover that based on the information published into your broker. But I still think that, again, in the projects at least that I've worked on, that maybe is not the main pain point always, right? I think that you still need to go and get the context from your downstream systems. And unless you're extremely well standardized, it still becomes difficult to make sense of the data that's coming in, even though it's coming in, right out of the box. So
Mhm.
I think like I'm still on the fence whether like one is 10x better than the other in every applicable scenario. I think that it needs to be evaluated on a case by case basis, but I certainly understand the advantages of MQTT versus OPC UA and vice versa.
Absolutely. We talked to Arlen on episode 67 about MQTT versus OPCUA. And I think kind of our general comments and my general comments towards everyone is both are really good solutions. I think that there are probably very few people out there who are going to tell you that you have to use one protocol and not the other. And if they are telling you you've got to use one protocol but not the other, they probably have some sort of ulterior motive behind saying one is better than the other. I have not used OPCUA PubSub, so I believe PubSub is also available as an architecture for OPCUA. I think there are some values of PubSub. Just in general. But if we look at OPCUA PubSub versus MQTT with its PubSub, I think that there are certainly different applications in which it is easier. On the MQTT side, we see a lot of consumer groups kind of leveraging MQTT because of its open source for data transmission, right? So I think Facebook Messenger, historically, in like a very big case study, kind of needed data transmission that was lighter weight than what they were currently using, found MQTT and solved battery drain and other issues that they were having kind of on the initial. I think MQTT is really good, especially if you've got a bunch of remote sites or remote wells. I think that makes a whole lot of sense. I think that if I were to go build a new facility today, I would strongly take a look at MQTT to see if, hey, does MQTT, because of cost, because of servers, because of network issues, because of a bunch of things, does it make more sense than potentially leveraging OPCUA somewhere? So I would say on my side, I would go take a look at all of those things. But to the conversation that we had with Arlen, I think that MQTT is only going to continue to gain traction as we look at different tools. I think we see a lot of hardware. If memory serves, I think all of the Opto 22 stuff is MQTT enabled. I believe you can get MQTT on the Siemens S7 1500. I think also S7 1200. So MQTT is right out of the box. The big laggard in protocols is Rockwell, right? So I do not believe you can get the controller compact logics with MQTT out of the box. And I think that in North America may be kind of holding it back. I know that there are a bunch of other service and solutions providers, Bedrock Automation. I played around with some of their kind of initial OSAs, their controllers. I know that those are MQTT, so there are certainly a bunch of opportunities, and all the way down to like the Raspberry Pis, right? So like I know that you can leverage MQTT with those. So I think we'll see a lot of consumer grade and a lot of consumer knowledge on that, especially because like you can throw up an MQTT mosquito broker and it's like $0. And so because you can do all of those things, and because they're really powerful tools, I think we'll see a lot of consumers do that. And maybe it's the opposite of what we see with ladder logic, right? Or maybe it's very similar to the conversation we were having, where coding and other hardware capabilities on the outside of the plant life go and bring opportunities on the inside of plant life. And so I think that could be very interesting. But we actually have some congratulations in order, Vlad. And man, I feel like had we realized this anniversary, we would have made announcements and things like that last week. So we had Burned on last week. Burned is, I'm gonna call him like the head honcho product manager for the initial S7 1500. Have you seen what happened like yesterday or 2 days ago? Did you see what anniversary it was for the S7 1500?
10 years, right?
10 years. Again, had we realized it, we could have made the announcements and like broke the story on Manufacturing Hub. But here we are, laggards a couple of days behind as opposed to a couple of days ahead. But that is amazing. It is amazing. One, that the S7 1500 has been kind of at the peak for the last 10 years. And two, honestly, that it's only been 10 years that they are kind of at the peak of everything they are doing. How many S7 1500s do you have behind you, Vlad?
Only one, Dave.
Oh,
Only one.
Siemens, John, Lewis, everyone on the Siemens side. You guys got to send Vlad like 25 more S7 1500s. If you guys look, he's got the wide camera angle going today. Look how much wall space he has to just like maybe all the way around and just husks of maybe just the S7 1500 boxes, and it can like frame all of your other electronics.
Yeah, I think it's again, maybe like on the protocol side, Dave, to bring us back, the comment I was gonna make is I think that a vast majority of applications can be done with MQTT or OPC UA, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's certainly gonna be edge cases, and I think that there's a lot of advocacy for using one or the other to gain some maybe improvement of using one protocol versus the other.
Mm-hmm.
But my comment, and to bring this back to the PLC side, I think that a lot of applications could be built on various different platforms, right? Like I think that we a lot of times are maybe very segmented into one or the other, but in non-edge cases, you can do it on either one, right? And to come back to the maybe even the ladder logic question, it can be done reliably in other forms of programming. It could be run on different PLCs, but I think again, when those edge cases come into play, that's where you're going to gain an advantage with maybe MQTT or OPC UA or with the Siemens platform, Rockwell, Opto 22, whatever that may be. And so those are, I want to say, the interesting scenarios, right? And I'm, how to say, like very excited to see those limits sometimes. And that's why maybe we push or try to push the envelope, right? Because again, I don't, let's say on the MQTT side, well, maybe it works really great with 20,000 tags. What about 100,000 tags? What's the trade off on, the pipeline versus me being able to pull, let's say, OPC UA every 5 minutes, right? And maybe that's all I need in terms of that specific data. So I'm going to pull only 5 minutes at a time, and so now my bandwidth is significantly less than MQTT sending constant messages between all the clients and the broker. But anyways, I digress a little bit. I think that there's certainly trade-offs with everything.
Yeah, let's not get into the OPCUA versus MQTT and have to pull out the whiteboard to determine how we want to send messages and how much bandwidth, etc., is being taken up with that. I think that we can all agree that there are very easy, very good opportunities to leverage either or both. I have seen many applications, especially newer applications, that are leveraging both for a variety of reasons. But if you guys are listening and are using MQTT or OPCUA or OPCDA or any of those other things, drop us comments below, send us messages. Yes, send us messages and let us know what your favorite protocol is and why you're using it. Vlad, do you have any other last closing comments before we say goodbye to everyone for today and tell them we'll catch them tomorrow morning to continue on the ITOT convergence theme?
No, I think this was a really good recap. I'm, how to say it, like I'm very grateful for being able to look back and see the conversations we've had, and it's almost like a flashback for me. And I start remembering that entire conversation as soon as I hear, maybe like a 2-minute clip. So I think it's great to be able to revisit that. I hope that we get to do this a little bit more often in the future. I want to thank everyone who's been listening to us, all the sponsors. I know there's a lot of people who are reoccurring or reappearing in our chat, so certainly want to thank them. And yeah, I think to 100 more episodes, Dave.
Oh, only 100 more, Vlad. You heard it here. Vlad is going to retire on episode 200. No, absolutely, Vlad. This has been fantastic. I've made the comment earlier today that when you and I initially started this, there were times where I weren't sure we were going to make it to episode 10. I don't know how we've made it to episode 100, but it has been amazing, and we've been very blessed to have some great guests. Yeah, we've been blessed to have some great guests, some amazing conversations. Thank you again to everyone who has come to hang out and listen or watch and listen over the course of the last 100 episodes. I feel like 2023 is certainly going to be the best year yet. We've got some awesome plans. I will go ahead and reiterate. So my plan is to take Manufacturing Hub to Hanover, Hanover, Messe, Germany, in the middle of April, and I am 95% tentative to head up Automate in Detroit at the end of May. We will see what Vlad's other commitments and if they allow him to go make it to an event at some point in the first half or the second half of this year. But my thought is we will continue to do more of those. If you guys have thoughts or feedback, we always like to talk to you guys. The best website to check us out is manufacturinghub.live. And if you have made it this far, please feel free. And we ask you to go ahead and hit that subscribe button on Solus, on LinkedIn, to go ahead and follow myself and Manufacturing Hub and Vlad. And if you are listening in podcast format, thank you guys for listening. I am honestly shocked. You guys continue to listen, and you guys continue to listen at significant levels comparative to kind of previous months. Every couple of months, we grab, I don't know, another 100 or a couple hundred listeners, which is pretty awesome. So if you guys are listening on podcast format, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button, that follow button, rate us 5 stars, and make sure that the latest episodes download automatically into your podcast feed. But no, until next time, which is tomorrow morning for anyone watching live, we will catch you all soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.